Let's give a warm welcome to Sebastien Lai and Jillian Melchior.
Well, it is my pleasure to lead this conversation today with Sebastien Lai. We have a chair here that is empty, and I want to call attention to that because I also want to introduce you today to his father, one of the bravest people whom I've ever met, and who can't be here because he is currently in a Hong Kong prison, facing up to life for defending the basic liberties of the Hong Kong people. So with that, Sebastien, I want to help the audience understand why the Chinese government views your father as such a threat. Can you tell us a little bit about what he stood for, how he stood for it in Hong Kong before his arrest, and what Apple Daily is?
Yeah, sure. So my father's story is actually relatively simple because it's a man who was willing to give up everything that he has in order to stand up for the freedom of his adoptive home. And actually, I watched this a BBC clip from 30 years ago, and it's him talking about the handover of Hong Kong in 1997 and whether he's going to stay there.
This is when it went from going as a British colony back to China.
Yeah, exactly. And it struck me very hard because they asked him, look, obviously Apple Daily is pro-democracy. It's the only pro-democracy daily newspaper in Hong Kong, and it's the biggest newspaper in Hong Kong. Are you still going to stay here? And in that video, he tears up. And he says, yeah, because I'm standing up for my home. And the bit that struck me is that he's done that consistently for the next 30 years until now, where he's in prison, but he's still fighting in his own way, even though he's silent, even though Apple Daily is no longer exists in Hong Kong.
So tell me a little bit about Apple Daily's closure. It's been a few years now, but the Chinese government forced the closure of this newspaper, arrested several of its senior editors, in addition to Jimmy. But what does this say about property rights and the ability to do business in Hong Kong right now?
I think it's one of those occasions where, so if you ask the Hong Kong government now, they'll still tell you that they have freedom of speech. But if you Google Apple Daily raids, you'll see 500 people running into a newsroom, taking laptops, arresting people. It's a stark contrast to what they say, and I think that's what it is. It's just, Hong Kong's a place where many people do business, right? And in the end, the only thing that makes a business transaction happen is trust. So how are you going to do business with a government that is so untrustworthy that they are willing to essentially destroy their free press out of vindictiveness?
Yeah. I mean, when they shut down Apple Daily, they not only arrested the editors to silence them, they seized Apple Daily's assets without due process.
Yeah.
And I personally think that's a warning about doing business in China and the business risks that you face in that environment. But I guess bridging over to that, your father wasn't always a newspaper man, but he has been a capitalist for a long time, a capitalist out of China. Tell me a little bit about how he made his money and how his story represents the Hong Kong story.
Yeah, sure. So the moment he landed in Hong Kong when he was 12, the first day he went to work in a sweatshop factory. They were making knitwear. They were making gloves. Sorry, I think. And he still has these scars from that time. So one of his fingers, for example, was partially cut by a machine. One of his ears he can't hear out of. But he remembers that time very happily. If you ask him about it, it's like a very happy time in his life because for him it was his first taste of freedom. As Bill puts it so well in the movie that we saw, the short clip that we saw, it was like it was suddenly seeing in color. And so he went from that to starting his own knitwear manufacturing, and then he decided that the retail margins were actually much more interesting than manufacturing margins, and he opened Giordano. And the premise of Giordano was essentially a clothing brand that would have a very limited amount of SKUs, so a very limited amount of clothing in different colors, but at a very high quality and a very cheap price. So a precursor to Uniqlo. And actually the person from Uniqlo says in his book that one of the inspirations that he had for starting Uniqlo was Giordano. And all that was, well and jolly until Tiananmen Square. Because before that, I think everybody assumed that China was getting more and more liberal, liberal in the sort of societal sense, as the economy grew. Tiananmen Square was when Dad realized that was not going to be the case, and that was when he decided to start Apple Daily, Next Magazine, and then Apple Daily, which was started in 1995, and because he believed that information is choice and choice is freedom. So the people of Hong Kong, especially as it was getting towards Hanover, needed a independent and unbowing source of information, and that is Apple Daily.
Got it. So Jimmy is a billionaire. He is somebody who has British citizenship, a British passport, and in 2019, when I went to interview him, he was at the front of the protest movement. He was in the front where there was tear gas, where the riot police were potentially going to beat people up. Here you've got this 70-year-old man out in the front, and I want to play a video clip. Jimmy can't be here to speak for himself today, but he spoke to me in this interview. And I want you to hear as an audience firsthand what he told me when I asked him, will you leave?
I've been one of the troublemakers. I can't just make trouble and then leave, so to speak, I can't just, I have been the opposition media for over 20 years. And I'm the owner of it. I can't just jump ship and leave the people holding the port. No, we will stay. Our media will stay until the last day, until they either close me or close our business or arrest me, whatever. We can't go. We can't go anywhere. It's impossible. This is not. It's not just. It's just not moral integrity, which it is. But it is also as a person. If I do that, my kids, my grandkids will despise me. My wife will despise me. What kind of man I become? Horrible. I'm 70. How many years do I have to live? 20 years? In the last 20 years, I make myself an asshole? I wouldn't do that. I'm crazy. No, whatever happened, I'll be here. I'll face them.
So I think that gives you a sense of the kind of man that Jimmy Lai is. And that risk that he faces is real. I want to talk a little bit about the national security law that the Communist Party imposed on Hong Kong. Now, this is a law that outlaws dissent. It's a law that is extremely ambiguous, so you don't know where the line is for speech that is offensive to the Communist Party and potentially punishable. But it is a law that is punishable by up to life in prison. And that is what your father is facing right now. Can you talk a little bit about the legal status of his cases?
Yeah, sure. So they recently delayed his trial. That was meant to happen in September the 24th, and now it's happened. It's happening. It's going to happen in December, and this is the fourth time they've delayed it. But essentially, as Jillian said, he's 75 right now. So national security law carries a life imprisonment sentence. But even if he gets 10 years, that is basically the same as a life imprisonment sentence, and he's been in jail for 3 years already.
So I want to talk a little bit about what we know about the conditions that Jimmy is in right now. Associated Press was able to break some news earlier this month. And what they were saying is that he is in solitary confinement. He is in a maximum security prison. 23 hours a day, he is in his jail cell. There is no air conditioning. Hong Kong is oppressively hot in the summer. I think 90 degrees and 100% humidity. He gets 50 minutes a day for exercise, but this is alone in a 16 by 30 enclosure surrounded by barbed wire. And this is what your father is facing for standing up for his principles. How is he holding up? Do you have any word of that? And what do you think is giving him the strength to carry on right now?
So I haven't seen him for 3 years since he was arrested. I can't really go back to Hong Kong because of the national security law and how broad it is. It's extraterritorial, and it's used very arbitrarily as well. So I don't know how he is, but I mean, I haven't seen him in 3 years. But I know that for him, his faith is incredibly important. My father's a very religious man. I think, you know, in order to stand up for what you believe in truly and sort of put everything you have to it, religion is a huge pillar. It's so incredibly important. And I think that, you know, knowing that he's doing the right thing, the right thing, and knowing that he stand up for his beliefs is psychologically, I think, is what keeps him very strong as well, and that people out there are you know, yeah, that people out there are inspired by his story. I think that is also something that keeps him very strong. But again, he is 75, and you know, like at that age, most people would be, you know, retired or you know, out there enjoying the, you know, sort of their life. So yeah, I mean, it's very sad to hear about the prison conditions and yeah.
Absolutely. I want to play another clip from my interview with your father, just talking about the importance of that moral authority and his moral grounding. Can you cue it up?
We don't have weapons. We don't have raw power. We have nothing except our moral power, which is exactly what the Chinese government don't have. That's exactly where we can win.
So when we're talking about the national security law, one thing that I would like this audience to understand, and this is for a very good reason that I'm about to tell you, is how broad it is. The Chinese government is not only trying to outlaw dissent in mainland China, in Hong Kong. The national security law claims the authority to censor and suppress and punish speech anywhere in the world. It claims the power to crack down on social media companies, to have them hand over information. It claims the authority to order them to remove posts. And if anyone passes through China who has offended them under the national security law, they're at risk. So I want you guys to know that, because Sebastian actually has some ideas about ways that you can help his father. But I want you to know that courage calls to courage everywhere, and that in standing in solidarity with his father, you will be taking a risk, and perhaps you should not travel through Hong Kong. So, Sebastian, can you tell me a little bit about what this audience can do to support your father? I understand there are postcards.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So the postcards that you have in front of you, I think he'd be incredibly grateful if you guys could just send a message of support. Nothing political, but just to know that, you know, that his story lives in people's minds.
So these postcards are on your table. We're letting you know now, so you can write a message of solidarity. Again, nothing political, nothing about the Communist Party. But you can let him know that you're thinking about him and praying for him. I'm sure he'll take a lot of comfort in that. And we'll have somebody toward the end of this session go through and collect these postcards. We're also going to take a photograph. On your table, you've got these. So we'll stand up at the end and take a group photo that you can promote on social media with the hashtag #FreeJimmyLai. Again, I'm reminding you, Chinese government has facial recognition software. The national security law is no joke. But I am always inspired by the courage of Jimmy Lai, and I hope that you are also inspired by that courage. You know, I want to play another clip for you, and this is because I think that what your father is going through is important for understanding the nature of the Communist Party. You know, I've been disturbed by how, among my generation, some in the United States and Europe think that socialism is cool again, and communism is cool again. Jimmy's a capitalist, and I asked him about this, and here's what he had to say.
I think those guys who think communism or socialism is cool again are those who has never had the history in their blood.
Thank you.
Or in their knowledge. And in general, I think people knows that, the socialist or communist ideology is debunked. It's totally lies.
So you unfortunately have that experience in your blood. What does Hong Kong say about the Communist Party, and what does your father's case say about the Communist Party?
Hong Kong is the representation of how China views values of freedom, of a free society. And what's happened in Hong Kong is essentially an exercise in the crackdown of a free society. And it's happened so quickly. I mean, within 5 years. Everything that you could do, I mean, a lot of things that you could do in Hong Kong, like say what you say, read what you wanted to read, that is no longer the case. And I think that it's, yeah, I think that is one of those historical moments that people will look back and say, well, this is when China decided that these ideas weren't theirs. And I think it's worth noting that the language that I use isn't necessarily a clash of ideals, because I'm sure many of you would know that the elites in Hong Kong and in China you send their kids abroad, send their kids to the free world. So I think it's one of those things where going back to the idea of moral authority is that people vote with their feet. And so only history will tell what happens to Hong Kong, but it's very hard to imagine a place thriving without the very, very ideals that made it thrive in the first place.
So on that, I want to take a audience question. What is the future of Hong Kong as a business hub under the national security law? Can Hong Kong survive under the national security law as an international financial center? And perhaps more important, what is the future of people who are stuck in Hong Kong?
I think, and that's a question we could all ask ourselves, right? I mean, are we willing to trade with a place where contracts might not be upheld, where if we offend someone, we might end up in jail? Because the thing isn't necessarily that the lines that they have it's not necessarily that they have solid lines where you know you shouldn't step over this line, otherwise you get in trouble, right? Is that they blurred it to the extent where, like this girl who liked a social media post and when she was studying in Japan went back to Hong Kong and she got arrested. So you don't really know where it is, and it's always a moving target. And in those circumstances, it's impossible to run a financial center. I think with what's happening to my father, you can't have someone in prison who is entirely innocent take all the newspaper, everything away from him, and tell people that oh yeah, we're still friendly to business. I mean that's in the end of the day, it's actually as simple as that. For the people of Hong Kong, I think a lot of people are leaving. It's not. You could just sort of look at again, nobody throws a party on their way out, right? But you can really see with the numbers of the rental rates, office occupancy rates. A lot of people are leaving Hong Kong.
Got it.
Because there's no longer a place where, even if they are happy, sort of cowering to the system, it's not a place where they want their kids to do that.
Got it.
To live in lies.
Just going back to the experience of communism, that firsthand experience. This can't be easy on you and your family. Can you tell me a little bit about the emotional impact just for you of what your father's going through and how, I mean, you're in the United States speaking on his behalf. What's it like to carry on his legacy and speak for him when he can't speak?
I think so it's worth noting that my dad escaped China when my grandfather, who was an industrialist, he got everything taken away from him, and so they were persecuted. And Dad decided to sort of try his luck. He tried to escape on the fishing boat in Hong Kong. So the whole difference of the story. But he knows how the communists are. He knows the consequences. He doesn't have what's the word? He doesn't have he has no illusions about what could happen. So even 30 years ago, even now. And so, as his son, I mean, on one hand, I'm incredibly inspired by what he's doing. I mean, because it's just, and I think that's partially why his story is so scary to the Hong Kong government, because it's someone that is obviously was accepted in that system. That system did very well for him, right? He made a lot of money and had, you know, all this prestige and whatnot. And he turned around and was like, no, actually, these freedoms do matter. We do want democracy. This is how our society, this is how Hong Kong society moves forward. It was part of the it was agreed in the handover that we would be able to elect our own leader, and for someone to be willing to sacrifice all that to stand up for these ideals that to many in Hong Kong are intangible, right? The ideals of freedoms are intangible. I think it's incredibly inspirational. And obviously, also as a son, I'm incredibly worried for him. But I think you can't really. I think one thing I learned about Dad is that you can't really make fear your guiding principle in everything that you do. And I remember him saying in one of the interviews, he says that fear is the cheapest weapon they have against you. Once they know that you fear them, once they cow you, then they have you in their pockets, and it's very hard to get back up.
And this is something that your dad stood up to for a very long time, even before his arrest. I remember hearing about how your family home was firebombed, some of the death threats. What is it about your father specifically? He seems like the Communist Party's public enemy #1 in Hong Kong. What's so dangerous about your father? What's so dangerous about the free press?
I think Dad doesn't look at it in terms of something adversarial. Mm-hmm. I think, you know, however people see him, he has no ill will towards other people. Mm-hmm. I think that's what makes what he does dangerous, because he's not looking for power or anything. He is just a man who is doing the right thing that he believes in, and that is running a free press that doesn't, you know, pander to the powerful, that doesn't leverage its power for more money and whatnot, and it is those ideals that he stands by. It's also those ideals that he felt like gave him so much in Hong Kong, right? It was also these freedoms that he felt really made him thrive from a refugee, a manual laborer to what he is today.
Got it. So we've talked a lot about the role of capitalism in changing his life and shaping his ideology. I'd like you to tell me a little bit more about his faith and how that's become the other pillar of who Jimmy Lai is. I think so. He turned Catholic around the time I was born, but it was basically because of. I think the start of it was because of my mother, who was, you know, very Catholic. He always felt like he was given a lot. He always felt like, you know, obviously, though he worked incredibly hard, he always felt like he was very lucky. And I think he could never really explain it. He could never really explain it with you know, atheism. And so I think at some point it just connected. Maybe it was the handover or whatever it is, and he felt like, you know, like rationally there's no, like pragmatically speaking in Hong Kong, rationally there's no it's in a authoritarian government, it's much better to stand with the government, right? I mean, I think everybody can agree with that, right? So I think it was that idea of, look, I know this is the right thing, and religion for him was like a guiding light, like a compass. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting to bring up, because when he speaks about moral authority, the Communist Party has been an enemy of religion. It's been an authoritarian government that's sought to squish that out. So I just want to note how much moral power that has. Now, we've told you what you can do to help Jimmy. I'm getting a lot of questions about what your father can hope for or ask for from the Americans, from the British. How is the free world responding to your father's plight right now? Are they doing enough?
So a lot has been done, and we're incredibly grateful. The US has spoken a lot on my father's case, and I think because to a US audience, what he's doing is very much it's something that the people living in the US, most people living in the US, intuitively understand, standing up for oppression and for on behalf of freedom. My father's a British citizen. The UK has spoken up more for him as of late, and I think it's really one of these cases where his trial's coming up, and the free world has to make it known to Hong Kong that they can't, have their cake and eat it too. If they have to be accountable to their actions and not what they say. So if they still tell people that there's rule of law, still tell people that there's a free press, still tell people that there's freedom of expression, then my dad is entirely innocent. I mean, there's no basis in why would publishing, why would being a publisher of a newspaper wind up in jail? That's not a thing that a society that accepts those values can. It's not coherent with what they say.
Mm-hmm. So your father's refused to plead guilty, and he's done that even though there would be potentially hope of leniency and hope of release. Why is it so important that this trial continue, and what can that communicate to the world about where we are with China and Hong Kong and the Communist Party right now?
Yeah, so he refuses to plead guilty because he's not guilty. But one of the cases, for example, that he got, charges that he got 12 months for was he went to a Tiananmen Square vigil to commemorate the Tiananmen Square massacre in '89, and he lit a candle instead of prayer. And for that, he got 12 months. And it's morally, I mean, it's crazy that someone would stand trial for that. So he pleaded not guilty, even though he might get some leniency or whatnot. He's not guilty, and everybody knows that. Sorry, what was the second question?
I mean, what does his case, when it does proceed to trial, what will that communicate? What does it reveal to the world about the nature of the Communist Party in both mainland China and Hong Kong?
I think his case, I think his case will show the world what Hong Kong thinks of these freedoms. Mm-hmm. Whether Hong Kong's willing to sacrifice itself as a financial center for this vendetta, or are they willing to stick to their words and realize that there's a 75-year-old man who's had everything taken away from him in Hong Kong, and that any longer in prison is just cruelty.
Your father described himself to me as a troublemaker in the clip that we heard, and I love that sense of mischief and happy warriorness of him. I think it's really cool that even from prison, he is a thorn in the Chinese government's side, and that he is using his life story to tell the truth about China. Is there a point at which he becomes too much of a troublemaker for the Chinese government, and they make the calculation that it's better to release him and have him as a dissident than have him behind bars in a way that is a illustrative case and brings a lot of shame on the Communist Party?
I think, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think the older he is, and obviously the more attention people bring to this, the more people realize that actually, like, this is a 75-year-old man. Are we really going to, is this huge system really scared of this person? They'll realize that actually he's much more trouble in prison than he is outside, because every time people think of China, people think of Hong Kong, his name will always be somewhere in the mix, sort of just reminding everyone that this is what these countries think of your values, of your true values.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go back to another audience question. Your dad was good friends with Milton Friedman, and Milton even mentions him in his book, Two Lucky People. There are pictures of you with the Friedmans. Can you tell me a little bit about his ideological development as a capitalist from a communist country?
So Dad didn't. Dad reads a lot. Dad's probably the person I know that reads the most, and his intellectual curiosity started with Road to Serfdom by Frederick Hayek, so I think just from that is where his school of thought is. He always believed that that's what made Hong Kong so great. This idea of a capitalist society. And there's actually quite a funny anecdote of when this was before he was banned from China, but Milton Friedman went to China and told Dad to come with him. And so they went together, and they were just sitting at a hotel. And back then, China was incredibly poor. They see this working girl at the hotel. She a lady of the oldest profession. Milton Friedman turns around to him and gives him an hour lecture about the economics of prostitution. And it was this amazing thing where he was just, because he was so fascinated by this. And my dad was like, yeah, for Milton Friedman, what was incredible is that everything was economics. It was like, even this thing. So yeah, I think that really led Dad intellectually, and he understood that a lot of these free market, the free market is based on all these freedoms that we have.
So your father certainly paid a price for his activism. You're paying a price too, right? I presume you can't go back to Hong Kong. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you're sacrificing to stand up for your father? You've lost a city.
Yeah, I lost a home and whatnot. For me, I don't really view it as. I don't really view what I'm doing as a sacrifice, because I think everybody that believes in freedom fundamentally agrees that my father should not be in prison. And so coming out here and speaking to you all and doing everything that I have to do it's something that I'm very happy doing, as long as I can see my father again. And I think that would be the biggest sacrifice if I can't see him again. I think that's sacrifice for me, but it's also sacrifice for this ideal of freedom as well. Mm-hmm. If this man who loves freedom so much gets locked up for the rest of his life.
So it's not just your father. One thing that struck me is in Hong Kong's opposition movement, its pro-democracy movement. I remember a day in January, I think it was 2021, where there was a roundup and about 47 pro-democracy activists were arrested. We've seen pro-democracy activists driven into exile. It's just wiping out of an entire intellectual movement. Your dad is so exceptional in some ways, and in some ways he typifies the Hong Kong spirit. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about just generally how the national security law is being enforced in Hong Kong against both prominent pro-democracy figures like your father, but also everyday people, housewives, moms, young people who went out and marched in the streets. What's going on with that?
I think it's because of how incredibly arbitrary it is. They are using it as and it's what Dad was saying, right? It's this idea of fear, right? They use this fear to control their people, and that way it looks like nobody's spoken out. But that's because all the pro-democracy newspapers or media outlets are essentially gone. So there's nobody speaking out. Everybody's afraid every person is afraid to say anything, because you never know when you're going to cross the line. So it's a horrible situation where the Hong Kong government can still tell people that it's a free place, when any person just reading the news realizes that is no longer true. And so it's almost this that there is this blanket of fear covering people's daily lives.
Mm-hmm. And looking through some of these cases, I know there's a database that maintains them, and just looking through it, some of the acts that are being punished or tried are really striking. I mean, there was one case where somebody played a song that the government didn't like on their harmonica and are now facing years in prison. A housewife who had posted something online, government comes down so hard. You mentioned the case of the student in Japan who made a social media post, came back to Hong Kong to renew her documents, cracked down on them. And I just wonder, you're from this city, you know its people well. Does Hong Kong still have, it's dormant, it's suppressed, but do you think that fighting spirit will survive among Hong Kongers?
I think, so Hong Kong is a place of refugees. A lot of people left communist China to be in Hong Kong. And with the freedom that were given to them, they really thrived, you know? It was a place where you always had almost like a sense of superiority with China, because China didn't have these freedoms. They couldn't say what they wanted to say. We could say whatever we wanted to say. I think that this idea of being displaced and having to fight for a place in the world is not just in Hong Kong, but it's something that is very much a Hong Kong story. So I don't know what's going to happen to Hong Kong, itself, but I think the people of Hong Kong have a very good chance to do well in a free society, given that they're not in Hong Kong, and I think anybody accepting them would be very lucky.
Got it. So I want to talk a little bit about how Hong Kong has changed just in the time that I've known this city. You mentioned the Tiananmen vigils that your father attended. And I remember being first year out of college, going to the Tiananmen Square vigil. And if you go to Hong Kong's Victoria Park, or if you went now in past tense, it would just be a wall of people standing there with candles lit, bowing 3 times out of respect. And it was so electric and so moving, just such an expression of recognition of the sacrifice of the martyrs of Tiananmen Square. And it was really meaningful to see that commemorated on Chinese soil. Hong Kong was still China. It was the only place. You can't do that there now. Where do you see that legacy, that commemoration of people like your father who have given up everything to stand for democracy? Where is that acknowledgement still happening in the world, and who's speaking for Hong Kong?
I think it's worth going back just on the Tiananmen Square vigil and what it actually meant, because it was one of those things where peaceful students went out to the street and then they were rolled over by tanks and obviously a very incredibly horrendous thing to have happened. And I think the fact that part of history they're trying to wipe off is incredibly worrying for the free world, because they're trying to absolve themselves of blame, whilst a democracy is iterative. This shows what a autocracy is. Autocracy does something wrong, and then it goes back and wipes it out and tells everybody that this is the truth now. And so I frankly don't know what the story of Hong Kong is, but I think the story of Hong Kong is a story of freedom, and I guess it's important for people in the free world to keep it in their heart, especially when they're dealing with China.
So with that, the Tiananmen Square massacre, we don't know how many people died in it. There's a list collected by the mothers of Tiananmen, and I'd encourage you all to look at it. It's horrifying. You see people who were plowed down by tanks, limbs ripped off, children shot in the streets. And it was so ugly that the Chinese government doesn't want that memory held anymore. In Hong Kong, however, I know when protesters were marching, there was a lot of fear and a lot of talk about Tiananmen Square number 2. This crackdown has proceeded differently. What do you think changed in the Chinese government's thinking that they would handle Hong Kong differently than they handled Tiananmen? And how bad can it possibly get in Hong Kong?
So, I think China recognizes that Tiananmen Square was a huge mistake. I can't speak on their behalf, but that's my understanding of it. Hong Kong was done in a much more I guess, I don't know if the word is intelligently, but efficiently, in the sense that if you guys remember back in the protest, it was really, they really managed to make it so that it's like police against students. They really managed to make it so that there was this hate between the two camps. And they did that by having, mainland police go to Hong Kong, hiding tags, all these sort of moves that makes you question an institution. And I think it's by breaking down all these institutions that they managed to crack down on Hong Kong. So I think that's one of those, I think it's you could sort of see that China has become smart in how they do this. And it's also worth noting that a lot of these autocracy copy each other. They see what someone else is doing, they see that nobody's speaking out, and then they themselves do it.
Got it. Well, the world has become a less free place in the past couple years, and that breaks my heart. But I am so inspired by your father's example. He's the bravest person I know, so thank you for coming and speaking on his behalf. We are going to take that photo now, so if you would like to be in it, please hold that up. We'll welcome our cameraman. We're going to take a couple across the audience. Again, I'll remind you, this is not without legal risk, and you might want to think twice if you're in this photo about going to Hong Kong or going to mainland China. All right, hold this up.
Should I hold it? Oh,
Yeah,
No, they'll go this way. I think.
they'll get this way, and then we'll go with us. Yeah. Are you guys ready? And please do tweet this out. Tweet out photos of yourself. You're allowed to take these with you around Steamboat. Feel free to take it around. We want to call as much attention to Jimmy's case and Jimmy's moral authority and what he's standing for. And this is something that you can do that will actually help. All right. Great. Well, Sebastian, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.